In January, in January, we will present the convention a resolution which will acknowledge the history of racial harm, and as far as we understand it and know it now, we know the history is bigger than we know, and we'll confess it, repent, commit to change the structure of the diocese, and also commit to the process of making restitution in as far as possible. That resolution will convene a working body for the kind of over the following year to determine what exactly that process of restitution will look like. I think that's everything. I want to talk very briefly up front, because I think some folks may have questions about this. Also about what we have chosen not to do. We have specifically, that we did consider it at the beginning of our work, we have chosen not to try and attach a specific monetary figure to these harms. We considered it briefly, but we came to the realization that there is simply no putting a price tag on 2 or 3 centuries of racist abuse. Nonetheless, we acknowledge, as we state here, that genuine reparation, as Jesus told us, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. So that if we're serious about this work, our faith calls us to put our money where our mouth is. So at some point, we will need to set a target and a goal, and I hope we make it an ambitious one. But at this stage, we've said it's not appropriate to make that definition right now. The other piece is that we've chosen specifically to focus our work on the harms done against the Black community in this country. And I raise that because I want to receive some questions, and obviously we acknowledge that there are other groups that do have legitimate claims to reparations. Most notably, of course, Indigenous Americans on whose land, most stolen land, our congregations sit. But we have chosen to focus on this particular history for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, we acknowledge that every group that has a legitimate claim to reparations has a distinct story to tell, and their path towards reparations must be distinct to acknowledge and honor that history. And we thought it diluted the work to try and kind of mash these all together. Secondly, we acknowledge that in this country, as well as in this diocese, anti-Black racism is foundational and formational for the way the project of racism and race develops in this country. It shapes everything else that follows. And finally, because of the vibrant community of historically and predominantly Black congregations in this diocese, we acknowledge that the Black community to whom reparations owe is a very living and integral part of our own community. And we thought it important to address what's working at home first. So having said all of that, that's kind of an overview. We'll hear more about all of that as we go along. I do want to introduce now our keynote speaker, the very Reverend Canon, Dean, Dr. Kelly Brown. For those of you who don't know, Dean Douglas is one of the preeminent theologians within the Episcopal Church and the Church at large. She has published a number, and I'm not going to try and list them all, but a number of works that are seminal in the field, including Black Christ, Stand Your Ground, Black Bodies, and the Justice of God, and her new book, Resurrection Hope, A Future Where Black Lives Matter. Dean Douglas is the Dean of the Episcopal Divinity School at Union Theological Seminary. She is the theologian in residence at Trinity Wall Street, and she is the canon theologian of our own Washington National Cathedral. Her article, which was published in Sojourners in 2020, A Christian Call for Reparations, was formational and foundational for how the task force has thought about its work. So we're very blessed to welcome her today. I'm going to see the podium in just a second, but I want to talk briefly about how we're going to do Q&A. We do have a period for Q&A with Dean Douglas following her talk. We want to make the very best use of the limited time we have available. So each of you has should have gotten a pad and a paper. And as Dean Douglas speaks, I would encourage you to write down questions that come up for you. And note, I said questions that come up for you. We deeply value your comments and opinions. We know you have hot takes that you want to offer. That is what Twitter is for. But for this time, we want to focus on listening and learning and growing our understanding. So we encourage you to write down those questions that seek more information, that look towards a deeper understanding. We'll have a chance to offer some of them
And then we will do our best to collect them all. I'm going to stay on that purple table in the back. You can often put them there on the break. We will collate them, we'll write them down, and we'll share them back with the group. So with that, Dean Douglas.
Thank you so much. And first, let me thank Father Peter for hosting us here and inviting me here. And this diocese, when I walked in this morning, I don't know what I'm always nervous, so it just made me extra nervous when I saw all of you here, and I don't know what I expected, but I do know what I felt the moment I walked through the doors in the back there. I felt a sense of pride for being a member of this diocese family. What a wonderful community and diocese and family to be a part of as we together learn from one another and are on this journey toward what I always call a more just future. And so I want to thank all of you for, I always talk about, it doesn't matter, make a mistake, get on the article. And so all of you for being on that arc and allowing me to journey with you on it. I thank our bishop, Mariann, for leading us in this sometimes uncomfortable, all the time hard, and all the time just work that will get us to that beloved community. And so I always tell people, but now this is we're all Episcopalians, or most of us, I assume, are Episcopalians here. So when I'm in other settings, people introduce me, I always say, Episcopalians love titles. Oh, God. But the most important title for me is Kelly and just a child of God. And so I am so glad to be here. I am, as a theologian and a child of God, and especially as a theologian, I don't have anywhere near all the answers, and I hope we can only ask the right questions together. And one of the things that is so significant in any theological work, and this is why I'm so grateful to this diocese, is that what makes my work even possible is being rooted in a community of folk who are indeed trying to be on that arc that bends toward God's just future, and allowing me to be on it with you and learn from you and be in dialogue. That's what it means for me to be a theologian, to be in community. And so it is a blessing for me to be in this community as we do this work. So that's all my prolegomata that is really trying to get my nerves out. So we're going to try this thing. I have a PowerPoint that is as much, probably more for me than it is for you, because it guides me along the way and will keep me in my parameters of 30 minutes, and then we can open it up for questions. And unlike my Episcopal roots in this way, sometimes I'm so passionate about this work that I go over 30 minutes. So I'm going to try to stay within those parameters. And we're doing a little thing here that I'm relaying when they're going to switch the screen for me. So we have that first one up. Can we see it? Yeah, the picture. Why reparations? I'm going to go through this quickly because I know that each of you, as you have done this very important work, know why we're here. But I want to sort of set the context for this quickly before we move even further into the theological response and the theological motivation for why we're doing this. Because anyone that so desires can do reparations, but what difference does it make that we are here as those who have claimed to be a part of the Jesus movement, of people of faith? What difference does our work make? But first, why reparations? We know, of course, that reparations is a part of this. We've come here because of this legacy of slavery that is the archetype, if you will, for white supremacy as it has expressed itself in racialized economic injustice. And so this question of reparations becomes a question for us because of that legacy. Slavery is the archetype of white supremacy that has expressed itself as racialized economic injustice. And it is done so in the form, as we know, of things like redlining, and you can switch the slide.
The slide's one ahead, so I think you're right right now.
Okay, restrictive covenants, these things that we know about. But what brings us here is that we know, we can switch, that these things are not simply of the past. The past, and remember this phrase for a minute, has remembered itself into our present. The past has remembered itself into, please switch. The past has remembered itself into our present. Okay, if it doesn't, so I'm going to keep going. I need to sort of switch the slide. Thank you. We're going to do this this little relay for the old-fashioned way. So be patient, and I'll be patient. The past has remembered itself, if you will, into our present. And there was no greater example of that for us, and it's part of the thing that has brought many of us to this time of discussing reparations and this legacy of slavery as the archetype of white supremacy. Then the convergence of two pandemics, which was the COVID pandemic that indeed converged with this sort of white supremacist legacy, and so that we saw that communities of color were at higher risk for health and economic challenges due to COVID. That's that. It wasn't just due to COVID, it was this past remembering itself into our present, right? That was the convergence of a health pandemic along with an ignored pandemic of the legacy of slavery, that's the archetype of white supremacy. And so, switch please? The other way that we continue to see this, switch please? Switch please? Thank you. The other way in which we continue to see this is we've just seen, for instance, what's going on in Jackson, Mississippi. When we think of things like environmental racism, this could not have happened without redlining, without restrictive covenants, without this legacy of slavery remembering itself into our present, because in order for environmental racism to occur, you have to have segregated communities, right? And so we see that in Jackson, Mississippi, the water crisis is an example of environmental racism. That is a further example of that long history of racist policies or racialized policies that have prevented the kind of infrastructure that needs to take place in Jacksonville. How else can we see this? Switch, please. Next slide, thank you. I don't have to tell you about the racial wealth gap, right? And we know, if you look at the slide, I'm going quickly through it, will take, they say, black families at least 228 years to earn the same amount of wealth as white families have today. At least 228 years. Next slide, please. And so it's about, I'm going to go quickly, it's about the wealth gap. Many of us, we've heard about that, and that becomes one of the foundational reasons that we talk about reparations. I will do a little theological twist on that a little bit later. But is the wealth gap, and when we think about the wealth gap, and all of this, again, you all know, and I'm just setting a context, that we're talking about more than black families not being able to own property and to own a home. We are also talking about the way in which that affects other realities of life. And so we know, for instance, that even though the percentage of black people that hold bachelor's degrees increased by 30%, yet black college graduates still earn less than white high school graduates. Black families headed by a college graduate decreased by the worth decreased by 4%. Right? And so we've seen that the unemployment among black adults decreased by nearly 20%, yet black employment rate is still the highest compared to all groups. Even among those who hold bachelor's degrees or higher, their unemployment rate is higher than whites who only hold a high school degree. This is the wealth gap that we are talking about that is more than simply the inability to own a home. Next slide, please. And so, and I encourage all of you, if you have not done so yet, to take a look, it's online, at the Urban League's report on the state of Black America. It was issued, I think, in May or June for 2020. And what they come up with is the Equality Index of Black America. And that equality, and they break this down in further categories, that equality index is 73.9%. That means that rather than having a whole pie, 100%, that African Americans are missing about 26% of that pie in every level and sector of our society. That's on an average, and in some levels and sectors of our society, they're missing more than 26%. But the overall equality index is 73.9%. And so this is what we're talking about, is the legacy of slavery that I always like to say is the archetype of white supremacy, because that's what we're really talking about, that has manifested itself as racialized economic injustice. That's what brings us to this conversation and this state of affairs, if you will, in our society. And so, here's the thing. You know, unlike other wars, for instance, that we have engaged in across the globe, the lack of reparations following the Civil War made this kind of chasm inevitable. Right. Made this inevitable. May I have the next slide, please? So now, here's the thing. We've talked about the socio-economic legacy, right, of slavery, right?
Yeah.
I know, try not to be so episcopalian. Little talk back. But what we rarely talk about, even as faith communities and as the church, is the theological legacy. Because the theological legacy matters. It matters. I've said, and I see some people who are part of the ASJ, the Anglican Studies Social Justice Formation Program that we have online here in the room, I've often said that in order for power, and this isn't me, this late philosopher Jarrett-Schell tells us this, that in order for power to really sustain itself, unjust, corrupt power, oppressive power to sustain itself, its most effective means for doing so is not coercive, it's not tyrannical, it's discursive, it's productive. That is, it creates a narrative, a discourse that will allow power to sustain itself by helping people to believe that the way things are is the way it is supposed to be. And it creates a discourse which will sustain the realities of inequality, oppression, and injustice. That will sustain notions of black inferiority, white superiority. Now, so it has this will to knowledge, if you will. and it calls upon certain fields of knowledge to supply it with the knowledge it needs to make people think, well, this is the way it's supposed to be. Can't help it. White folks are better, black folks are inferior. Now, if you can get two fields of knowledge on your side, you got a pretty good chance of sustaining your inequitable and just oppressive power. One is science. That's why you just listen and look today. It's so important to attack science. Because when you attack science, then you can call, if our science is suggesting ways that does not sustain white superiority and white supremacy, you attack it and you can call that into question. And then produce your pseudoscience. Right? Telling you that you don't know and that you don't see. The other thing is theology, religion. If you can put a sacred canopy over your beliefs, they are daggone hard to move. If you can connect your ideology to a theology, if you can legitimate your oppressive practices with a sacred canopy that connects it to God, how do you get that? Wrestle that out of place. It's hard. Again, I don't need to just think about what's going on now and how there is always a religious, theological, a sacred canopy that sustains our oppressive realities. And we see it today, even if we want to call it white Christian nationalism. It's a manifestation of a different legacy. So, we have to talk about the theological legacy. Because I think we have a particular role to play in that regard, to dislodge some of this stuff that is the legacy of slavery. So I like what W.B. Du Bois says, if the nation's religion is its life, well, white Christianity is a miserable failure. What legacy am I talking about here? May I have the next slide? I am not talking, may I have the next slide? I am not talking about a legacy that you all have probably well know because the work you've done here, which is phenomenal work, recovering the history. But I'm not talking about the legacy of sort of the obvious, if you will, kind of white supremacist, Anglo-Saxon races, the obvious folks who have sustained and blatantly put forth an argument for slavery. And so our own 8th presiding bishop, we know, Bishop John Henry Hopkins, the Diocese of Vermont is doing a lot of work in looking at this history and this story. That's not what I'm talking about. Next slide, please. I'm talking about a legacy in which all of you know, our church as a body did not question the institution of slavery because it saw it as a political and economic issue, not a moral and theological issue. Now get this, because this is why we're here. This is the turn, a little turn I want us to make today. Looking at it now as a moral theological issue. It is not simply, hear me right now, as my son would say, don't get it twisted. I'm not saying that it's not a political and economic issue. And then we have to talk about reparations in that regard. But we have to also acknowledge that it is a moral and theological issue. Anti-black, white supremacy is a moral, theological issue. We got to name it. And that really hasn't been named, right, in our society. That's the first thing. So the Episcopal Church, the theological legacy of not simply of our church, but the theological legacy in general, is ignoring this issue and in terms of it being a theological and moral issue. That's a legacy we carry forward. And so how does it play itself out? You say, oh, okay, well, whatever. It's harmless. No, it's not. Oh, may I have the next slide, please? It's not harmless. Because today, here's what we find. that 75% of white Christians believe black people play the race card. Like, too much. Less than 40% believe the legacy of slavery plays a role. Just think about those two statistics, that data for a minute. How we get to that point. I'm not talking about general society, I'm talking about white Christians. Because we have ignored this issue as a moral and theological issue, so that it has allowed 75% of white Christians to believe that black people played a race card too much, and believe that the legacy of slavery does not play a role. May I have the next slide, please? The other way, of course, in which we see this legacy moving forward into our present. We remember Dr. Martin Luther King's words from the letter of the Birmingham jail. The ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people. That's why I say I'm not talking about the legacy of a John Henry Hopkins. It's the silence over that by the good people. Because I declare most of us are good people. Or at least want to be. Try to be. And we would not claim ourselves. We know white supremacy when we see it. Racism when we see it. And we would hold ourselves apart from that. But what about this thing that is the legacy that is the silence? That has not named it. I mean, not in your household, named it out loud as a moral, theological issue. And what does that mean then? Let's now get to this reparations thing. May I have the next slide? What's the, thank you, the theological response? Well, we've heard it. We're sitting here talking about repairing the breach. But here's the twist for those of us who sit here in this room today. Yes, we have to repair the breach that, as the past has remembered itself into our present, that it is created in terms of the wealth gap and all of its ramifications that I spoke about earlier. But we have another breach to which we must hold ourselves accountable. It's, I think, particular to us. And that is the breach between our unjust present and God's just future. To repair that breach takes us beyond simply, obviously, apologies, and simply beyond monetary reward, monetary, gifts. I don't even say gifts. I can't think of the word I want, but monetary, whatever, resources to communities of people who, i.e. the black community, who's been most impacted by this legacy of slavery as the archetype of white supremacy. Because what that does is we can do that, but nothing happens to do something and mitigate and change the conditions that have brought us here in the first place. The systems and structures continue forward. Even as we are paying monetary rewards and other things to those people who are most impacted by it, then we'll end up this same place, the next generation will end up in this same place, unless we do something to change the systems and the structures, and there's something more we have to change that I'll get to, that have created the gap in the first place. So our particular task, I think, is to look at the breach between our unjust present and God's just future, or the beloved community as we talk about it. Now, here's the thing. This is, we got this person called Jesus, that's the Christ at the center of our faith. This is what Jesus was all about, because this is the gospel good news. Jesus was trying to bring those of us who claim to follow him not so much to himself as he was to the kingdom of God, to the kingdom of heaven, to that more just future. His evangelism is about bringing a people to God's future. That's the gospel good news. That's the center of our faith. That's the center of our mission. That's what we're supposed to be about. That's reparation work. If we really, really, really are guided by the gospel and are a part of, as our presiding bishop calls us, into the Jesus movement, then it is a movement toward a just future, God's beloved community. That's why all those things go together in what our presiding bishop in our national church talks about. That's Jesus. That's reparation. That's the breach that we have theologically ignored. We've got to lead the way toward closing that gap, that breach. Which means, you all have heard this phrase and it gets used a number of ways, but we have to be that already but not yet reality of God's heaven on earth. That was Jesus. Following Jesus means being that. So here's the thing. Get this little sort of sleight of hand, if you will, theological hand. We should have been about reparations all along. Shouldn't have taken this moment. That's inherent, intrinsic to our identities as Christians. How to repair the breach. Isaiah wasn't talking about this racial breach. He ain't talking about race. That's anachronistic. There are other, talk about ethnicity, etc., but we're talking about white supremacy. Isaiah was talking about the breach of where we are as a world and where we're supposed to be as the world that God created. That's the breach. Jesus wasn't talking about white supremacy. Jesus was talking about the breach of where we are as a world and a people in relationship to who we were created to be. So, first of all, I say one of the slogans of that I often use is that social justice isn't the add-on, it's the gospel. Well, reparations ain't the add-on to our identity. It's intrinsic to our identity if we think about it in relationship to repairing the breach between the present and the future, God's future. You all with me?
Yeah.
You don't have to be, but at least let me know you out there. Then you can push back. That should have been. Now you got to change. I forgot to tell you to change slides. Give me 2 slides. There was the already not yet. Now give me another slide. The next slide, please. Thank you. I'm sorry. My bad. So, when we think about repairing these breaches, I'm going to move quickly now. I know I've got like 10 minutes now, Peter. When we think about repairing the breach and reparations, we typically think about that systemically and structurally, right? The political, the economic. But I've always been, this is sort of haunted now by something King said. He said, "It may be true that the law cannot change the heart, but it can restrain the heartless." And he says that, so while the law does not change the hearts of men, it does change the habits of men, of people. And so he said, we got to pass these laws. We've got to change policies. Because we can't can't rely on changing the hearts of people. And I always say, so if you don't change the hearts of people, then it's easy, as we now see, for laws to be rescinded, for policies to be rescinded, and new laws, bad laws, unjust laws to be enacted, and unjust policies to be enacted. Our first task. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. We have to turn first toward ourselves. What's the theological mandate for that? This thing called a model day. Right? It's interesting that Jesus, it's not an either or, it's a both and, but this side gets ignored. And maybe it's harder. You know, Howard Thurman would talk about it in this way, sort of the charity barrel of giving. It's easy to sort of give clothes to the poor, put a little money in the coffers. It's easy to do the charity barrel work because you can keep all of that at a distance, and certainly at a distance from yourself, and not think about the ways in which you have been shaped and sustained unjust realities. Jesus focused not simply on the social, the ecclesial, and political structures of his time, but the people. We are a people, here's what's a fact. This is a fact. We are created in the image of God. Imago Dei. That's a fact. I really don't know anyone that isn't. It's no one's proven that. So there is someone that isn't. But here is also a fact. Though we're created in the image of God, doesn't mean that we act like it. And that we live into that. We are, another way to put it, children of God. But that doesn't mean we act like it. And so the Imago Dei, theologically, is a fact and a challenge. It's a call. It's a call for us to live into what that means. To live into who it is God created us to be. So that means this. May I have the next slide, please? How do we repair the breach between who we were created to be and who we are? That's hard work. And I declare we need to continue and lead our churches in doing that work. The breach between our faith and our values. And who we are. You all with me? Yes. This is the work of reparations. Fundamental work that goes along with policy and all of that. But policy and law change means nothing if we aren't looking at this breach. This is the breach, again, between the present and a just future. Where does that work begin? Next slide. Oops. Next slide, please. Thank you. I'm getting better at this. Begins with changing the narrative. Remember what I just said earlier about discursive power? We can see that playing out in our country today. One of the biggest fights right now is on critical race theory. And what's said and taught in our schools, it's really about changing the narrative, trying to hold on to a narrative. Now, the changing of that narrative has to happen. If it's going to happen out there, it's got to happen for us. And you remember what I said, that 75% of white Christians believe that black people play the race card like too much, and less than 40%, this is what kills me, does not believe in believes that slavery has no role in what's going on, or that slavery has a role. But think of ourselves and what brings us to that. How do we change the narrative within ourselves? Next slide, please. That helps us to move away from racial stereotypes. Those racial stereotypes matter. They create this unjust society that we're in right now. Now, if you think, I don't really, think of the things you've read in the news that those of us who are blessed with heavenly grace have known about forever. One of the first things that I knew when it came to sort of selling one house that we were in is that you gotta take down, what you gotta do, someone shaking their head, take down any evidence in that house that a black person is in that house. I was told that like immediately, you know, so it's like running around taking the black pictures out of my house. I also we experienced when we moved to where we're moving now in Montgomery County, we experienced folks trying to give us our new home, and the contractor told us what we should expect for mortgage rate and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, we get to the bank they led us to, and they were giving us these outlandish numbers and saying that we had to pay this outlandish down payment. And like, you know, there's always this point of naivete, and I'm like, oh no, we aren't going to be able to move, and blah, 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 blah. And then I talked to my parents who were still living then, and my dad said, that's like redlining. I'm like, how could I be so stupid? And went back, and then our contractor had to go to, anyway, it became that kind of mess that it becomes. But these are stereotypes. Think of the ways in which stereotypes about various racial groups help create policies. It has led to the medical racism. You know, this is why I was very diligent to the point I think it drove my husband crazy. That I was determined I was going to have a black OBGYN, because I was not going to fool around trying to convince somebody that it hurt. And I was equally determined that I was going to have a black pediatrician for my son, because I wasn't going to fool around trying to convince somebody that he needed medical attention. Those are stereotypes. We have to change the narrative. We have to change those narratives for ourselves. And just think about the ways in which you wince when sort of a group of black teenagers with dreads walk across the street and you suddenly check to make sure your door's locked. And you wouldn't do that when a black or white teenager. Just those little things, you know. Repair the breach between who we were created to be and who we are. That's reparations work. How do we change the narrative? And I don't know, we can talk about how you do that, and I'm going to move quickly. It matters that we keep telling this narrative in our faith tradition. Only one gospel tells it, and yet it becomes the whole narrative of Christmas. That Jesus was born in a manger. In an inn, because there was no room for him in the inn. Ask ourselves why that matters. Why we keep telling it. Not because this is a little cuddly story, because it really isn't. I used to cry when I heard it's like, how did they let that little baby be born in a manger? That's what I used to say to my mother. And she'd go, I don't know. First, it lets us know that God's just future, God's entry in this world, begins with manger people in our society. We talk about the marginalized, I talk about the manger people. those people for whom there's no room for them in the end. Our gospel narrative starts there. And we only have one gospel that talks about it, yet we talk about it. That frames our whole story. There's a reason for that. If we're going to repair the breach and close the gap and change the narratives, we have to start where God starts, with the narratives of manger people. That means this. Oh, did I tell? I didn't have you switch the slide. That was the name. When I'm talking about something that ain't up there, someone out there needs to say, don't be Episcopalian. Y'all can say, it ain't right. Switch, could you, next slide, please? Ah, Black stories matter. They matter. We have to now bring them to the center of our lives, our community's lives, our church lives. We're still talking about reparations, folks, and this isn't usually what we think about, is it? We think about where we gonna spend our money. Well, we might spend our money now, yeah, outward and inward. So we can create and help churches create and sustain this kind of hard reparation work. Black stories matter. They help us to change narratives about the way we think of other people. Change narratives about the way we think about our society and world. Why do you think everyone is so up in arms about the 1619 Project, which was kind of, I didn't even think it was all that radical. It's good. But we also have to make clear that, change the next slide, please. Next slide, please. We have to make clear that this is a story that matters to God. If it didn't, maybe Jesus wouldn't have been born in a manger. But it matters to God. Now, this is why this becomes important. Because we know, Father Peter talked about sort of anti-blackness, that the black body has not been seen as a sacred body. The black story hasn't been seen as a sacred story. It's not a story in which God is telling us something.
Great, and
God is moving. And if we don't know that story, we miss out. This is the theological affair. If we don't know that story, we are missing out on something about who God is. I mean, that's just clear.
Catherine, please mute your.
To ignore that story is to cut ourselves even further off from the mystery that is God. To me, there's no greater theological imperative than that. So that means we have to bring these stories into our preaching, into our pulpit. Karl Barth said, put a newspaper in one hand and the gospel in the other. Do that and make those newspaper stories those stories of manger people. Because that's where we're going to find God. And then we can all get to heaven. Next slide, please. Prophetic proximity. We talk about that thing from Isaiah of repairing the breach, but that's just like a verse. There's a wider, if you will, sort of pericope that it comes from. Is this not the kind, I'm not going to read the whole thing because now I'm like that in 30 seconds or something. Is this not the kind of fasting I've chosen to loose the chains of injustice, the cords of to set the oppressed free, obviously from which Jesus will later preach? If we're going to talk about repairing the breach, we need to carry forth that whole text. Because it tells us where to begin. And it's about prophetic proximity. Next slide, please. And it lets us know that the Jesus movement goes through the cross. Crucified realities. Next slide, please. Here's a word I want you to, some of you have heard this word praxis, right? From liberation theologians. This is what our faith needs to be about, because it is what faith is about. Faith is about partnering with God and fostering a more just future, moving us toward God's kingdom. Praxis, what I call crucifying praxis, is not a synonym for action, though action is a part of it. Praxis begins, yes, in action, that in that prophetic proximity, making ourselves proximate to those major people.
The bridge I told you about? We're doing the work for those we cannot see. This is what Jesus said. Permit the children to come to me, do not hinder them, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. I like to read that another way. That the kingdom of God, the beloved read them, they're about our children and those we cannot see. They're the center of our reparation movement. It's not about so much us, the present, it's about creating a better future. People have often heard me say that, when I think about hope, I think about my great grandmother who was born into slavery, whom I knew. She died when I was young. But I think about those people who were born into slavery, lived in slavery, never ever breathed a free breath, ever thought they would breathe a free breath, but they fought for freedom anyhow. They were fighting for those of us they could not see. Trying to bring our future a little bit closer to the justice of God. That's reparation work. It's the work of hope. It's the work of hope. And so I end with this. Remember I said for you to, oh, next slide, please. remember when I said to remember the phrase that I began with, that the legacy, when we talk about the legacy of slavery, this archetype of white supremacy, that we're talking about the past remembering itself into the future. We are people centered around the Eucharist. And in those words from the Eucharist are the words of Jesus that says, do this in remembrance of me. That word remembrance is the Greek word anamnesis. It is not mental recollection, mental recall. It's about bringing the past into the future. We are called to bring the past that was Jesus. The past into the present. I'm sorry. We are called to bring the past that was Jesus into our present so that we can repair the breach between our unjust present and God's just future. I'll end there. Thank you. Thank you. So here we have.
Wow. Thank you for their comprehensive presentation, your poignant but illuminating remarks, focusing our attention to the deep historical connection between theology and racism. And I know I have many takeaways, and I know you all can't wait to ask the questions. Just a few themes that stood out to me at the beginning of the presentation that I want to reiterate. Discursive power. How white supremacy and theology created a narrative of justification, white superiority against black inferiority. The legacy of slavery is the archetype of white supremacy. Lastly, what difference does our work make as people of the Jesus movement? So that being said, give you all about 2 minutes to express your questions to one of your neighbors near you, and then we will go into the larger Q&A with Dr. Budde. Thank you.
Where do you start? Yeah, Joy. Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, wow, he's great. Yeah. Oh, yeah. He's doing some good work. Yeah.
All right. So there's a good conversation coming on. So we're going to bring it back into the larger Q&A with Dr. Douglas. It will take about 3 questions. And it was recently brought to my attention that I forgot to introduce myself. I got so excited. But yeah, my name is Rudy Logan, and I am the interim mission director of justice of the Equal Diocese of Washington. So I'm going to invite all of you, well, time is limited, so we can only take 3, apologize for that, but either share your question or a question that your neighbor shared with you. So, okay, you were first.
Okay, then so I want to make sure I hear your question and so that I'm answering it. How do we speak to people's hearts? Are we talking about engaging white nationalism, citizens about white side?
Yeah.
Help me. Yeah, thank you for that question. And so I will say, thank you. Asked, how do we speak to the hearts of people, particularly the hearts of people such as white men, white Christian nationalists, get that we see. And so let me try to answer this way. First, there was a time when I said, and I still struggle with this one. I said, you know what? There's some folks that you aren't going to leave. And one has to recognize that. And you move them by doing the work that you know you're called to do. At the same time that I said that, and I do believe that, but I also recognize that Jesus' thing about the work, the kingdom of God will divide families is true. And this becomes a very painful reality in many families. And perhaps in the families of folks that are in your parishes or in your community or your families. And so how do you begin? You love those people. Do they, some of them, well, we're all crazy. They aren't bad people, and I mean this, and even if you think about, as much as we're enraged and all of that about what we saw happen on January 6th, the stories that moved me about that, and you'll be surprised to hear this from some of the people who were down there, some of the people, you really believe what they were doing was right. And they aren't bad people. So how do you speak to their hearts? So thank you for that question. I think Jesus taught us how to speak to their hearts. And he did that, one in the way of the golden rule. And I talk about, many people heard me talk about it before, but it's the only thing I got right now that helps me. And I call it the reverse bullying. I ask people, do you want a decent house to live in? Do you want enough food on the table? Do you want to feel safe when you walk out of your house? Do you want to not have to tremble when you hear police sirens behind you, maybe stopping you for a traffic stop? All those things. Do you want enough health care for yourself and your loved one? And I don't know anyone, no matter how their values and actions may be so contrary to what I believe is just, I have yet to find anyone that says no to those questions. They want those things. And then I just simply say that don't withhold from another that which you would not want withheld from yourself. And go about trying to create a society, a community, world that doesn't do that. So that's the beginning of me trying to speak to their hearts, speaking to their humanity, and trying to help them to see the humanity of the other that they are others. Some folks, you aren't going to move, but that's my best way in. And I think that was Jesus' way in. He gave us the golden rule, and he called us to the least of these, to feed the hungry. And we just ask people, do you want to be hungry? Nobody else needs to be hungry either. To feed them. Hope that helps.
All right, do we have?
Thank you so much. I'm deeply moved by everything I learned today. Take it with me. There's a question here that I have a framed question. I'm the head of school at Bishop Walker School for Boys. I'm here with my board chair, Andy Clark. Named after Bishop John T. Walker.
Yeah.
So we're 98% American boys. And my question, I'm happy to say it because I don't want to let anybody off the hook. You know, I think that happens at times when you ask a question like this, but it happens. How do we prepare the breach within our community between who we are and who we were created to be and internalize the question how does reparations in a systemic, practical way address the deep and internal hurt that we were born with? That discursive white supremacy.
No, thank you, and I think everyone can hear that question. Thank you for that question. I think that lets no one off the hook. I know that oftentimes depending upon who asks that question, sometimes it's sort of the way when people say, well, I don't know why you talk about slavery. I can see people in slavery, and that's those folks off the hook. That's not the question you're asking. The way you're asking it. I heard that in your head. Look, James Baldwin's talking about this a lot, and this is what his letter to his 14-year-old nephew was about. Audre Lorde talked about this a lot. Audre Lorde said that we have to find a way to first get that piece of the oppressor inside of us out. James Baldwin says his 14-year-old nephew, please, 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 in that letter to his nephew, do not believe what white society, I'm paraphrasing him, is trying to make you believe about yourself. We are socialized into the same white supremacist world as everybody. And that means that we have to, so the work, that doesn't let people off the hook. We got to change these narratives here in our lives, and in our schools, etc. And that means that we have to do that intentional extra work within our community and as we raise our children. That's why the Black church has been so important. I remember and when I say black church, I mean black congregations within white denominations, all those, and some of you who were part of or grew up in black congregations and this type, but know the story. I mean, in the black church I raised my son in that I worked in for over 20 years, Holy Comfort, we would have, Desmond learned and Langston Hughes poetry there. And quoted Langston, they would get up and do those programs, and I too am American. Desmond didn't know what he talking about, but I too am American. Right? And he still says, I too am American. And he goes, where did this come from? And then it's like, we do these things in our churches to affirm our children because we know that the outside world won't. We have to do the intentional work in our household, with our children, and in our society. I know that there's this big controversy this big white supremacist manifestation of everyone getting all upset because the Little Mermaid is black. Really, y'all know that's true. It's all over the place. Watch a video. It's on YouTube of two little black girls. Has anyone seen that video? Yeah. It's really right. Made me cry. The two little black girls were watching it, and they said, "Mommy." That's the work of our society, we gotta do, and that's what we have to do. And in the black community, we have to find a way to make sure that that piece of the oppressor does not make comfortable haven within our children. And we know that work becomes even more important now because of what's happening, taking in our education systems, communities and schools where they're trying to take their history, their story, all this stuff out of the school curriculum. And so our work is, that's why a school like the Bishop Walker School is important. That's why it's important. I'll say this last thing, I only know the experiences I have and try to. My son, when he was in elementary school, was going to an elementary school where he was, as I like to say, one of the few buttons on the blouse. And I knew what I was giving up in that, right? But I needed him to get a good target, good education. I remember saying to the principal, when they began to track my son and claimed that he couldn't read when he went to school, and disconnected him from the readers in the first grade, and then all the readers ended up being white. And I said to the principal, look, I've been comfortable with school because I thought you were going to help my son prove who he was as a black person. That's going to be my job. That's the price I paid to see you. But I declare you are not going to penalize my son because of your rights. If it means I have to stand up here and come this way and make sure he is in the right program. And I wish you did. That's what I removed from, so I said I don't have time to do that to do your job. But I recognize the intentionality that had to go into my making sure that the messages that they were going to try to get him, he had something that let him know that those messages weren't about him, but were about him.
Say one more.
One more question. Kelly needs to not answer them so long. One more? Is there one more?
So I don't have service while I'm up on the stage.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
What are examples of positive behaviors in Eat Out churches to help congregations minimize tolerance of negative racial stereotypes among all races?
Well, now that's a question for you all to think about. What is the positive example in your churches? I'm not in all these churches. So I don't know. I know what went on in my church, that I worked in for over 20-some years. We had not only positive images of Black folks in that church, and did all kind of programs for our Black children. And we even, when things happen in the wider world with Trayvon, all of that, we had special, we didn't act like it wasn't happening out there. And conversations, but we also had in our church multicultural festivals. We had, because our church was really a church that was reflective of the African diaspora. So we had multicultural festivals, but we also, and we also were intentional. We didn't necessarily have, Latinx people within our congregation, and we didn't necessarily have people from the global South in our congregation, but we were very intentional about those kind of representations, even in iconography. In our congregation, because we knew what the lack of that kind of religious iconography and representing various bodies or sacred bodies, what it did to Black people. So we were really kind of intentional about that within our congregation. So I don't know what you all can answer that question. What do you do? We were also intentional about not singing "Fair Lord Jesus," "Fair Lord Jesus." I'm serious. And the little boy who white as snow, that was fame. And so, but that's, and you have to, those are serious things. And they create narratives, and internal narratives that aren't intentional. So I think that's a question for discussion in the small groups. Give some examples, and what are good examples, and what are things that we need to think about. Okay, I think, thank you.
Yeah, we're gonna go ahead and amend the agenda. We're gonna take our break right now. Rick, while we're taking the break, can you go ahead and play the first congregational research testimonial from St. John's? There will be a video playing that's going to talk about historical research that's gone on at St. John's Norwood. We do encourage you to step up while you're doing. You've got the bathrooms. You can get yourself a cup of coffee, stretch your legs. We're going to get back right here in 10 minutes. Okay? But first, I'd like one more round of applause for our female speakers.
Thank you. I saw you out there. I just saw the top of your head.
I'm Kathy O'Donnell, a parishioner for 42 years at St. John's Norwood in Chevy Chase. I have volunteered in the archives at St. John's since 2008 and served as the archivist there since 2011. The files in the archives go back to the founding of our parish in 1873. While doing research on the founding of St. John's, I was dismayed to discover that prior to the first services in Bethesda, Chevy Chase, our founding rector, the Reverend James Battle Everett, was the first commissioned chaplain in the Confederate Army and served in the cavalry. He was very proud of his service. I'm Kathy O'Donnell, a parishioner for 42 years at St. John's Norwood in Chevy Chase. I have volunteered in the archives at St. John's since 2008 and served as the archivist there since 2011.
clap once. If you can hear me, clap twice. If you can hear me, clap 3 times. Thank you very much. Okay. We were incredibly blessed by our keynote address. I'm very grateful for all the questions that you offered. I do need your and he's going to present his presentation on the slavery's legacy and EDOW. I'm getting some terrible feedback there, sorry. Following that, we're going to go into lunch directly. Can you hear me? No, okay. After that, we'll go into lunch. During lunch, we're going to do the second breakout session. We're going to do the second breakout session at that point because it is something we can actually do during lunch. Following lunch, we're going to hear the congregational research testimonials, these set of videos that we have here together. Then we'll go into the first breakout session, which you have there, how to make amends, a lesson on reparations. Okay, we got this all together. You don't have to write the notes. We'll get it taken care of. That's good enough. Yeah, Franklin, go ahead. So I'd like you to offer. Oh, please. Yes, what's going on? Got it. I will remember this in the future. Frank.
All right. Let's put this back over here.
Rick, we're going to need Franklin's slide presentation.
All right. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Yeah. I'm not a big microphone person because I worked in the theater for quite a while. So I think I could probably let you, but we'll go with it, right? Do we? I'm sorry. What? Speaking into the mic. All right, because I can get really loud if I have to. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start because I printed mine out. So anyway, so I'd like to begin today. Welcome, and I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Today we meet on the lands that were once the home of the Piscataway Conoy and its related tribes. And may we remember and honor them. Yes?
Friends, I'm going to ask you all to stop talking now.
Oh, is there feedback over here? Do I need to do anything?
No, you can't. Speak up.
All right, here we go. All right, so can you hear me now? Yeah! All right, so it's like being in a rock concert, isn't it? So I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. Today we meet on lands that were once the home of the Piscataway Conoy and its related tribes, and may we remember and honor them. Oh, there we are. We got it. Awesome. And a personal verse for myself today, which is kind of what led me into working with the Reparations Task Force, is the Great Commandment. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like unto it. Love your neighbor as yourself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. So, next slide, please. So we're going to be talking about enslavement and the church in Maryland, 1692 to 1864. There we go. All right. So how many of you are a fan of Dr. Henry Louis Gates and Finding Your Roots? Awesome. All right. So what are some of the hallmarks of that program? Anybody? Just shout it out. What do we always just wait to find out in that program?
Where you came from.
Where you came from. What else?
DNA.
DNA, yes. What else?
Who you're related to.
There we go, who you're related to. So at the end of the show, what I always really love and what I think he does in an amazing way is show that there is no other. We are all connected, whether we know it or not. And the realization of that is part of the fun of watching that program, because they find out things they didn't know, maybe didn't want to know, but we are all connected. So, next slide, please. All right, who am I? Franklin Robinson. I'm an archivist with the National Museum of American History, the Archive Center, Smithsonian Institution, lifelong Episcopalian, and the parish historian at St. Thomas Episcopal Parish down in Prince George's County, Croom and Brandywine, if you've ever been there. And I was contracted to research the roots parishes, 8 of which made up the EDOW from 1692 to 1864. All right, so next slide, please. All right, so here we are with finding your roots, right? Things to keep in mind. The research is ongoing. Completion is contemplated for early 2023. Maryland is not Virginia. That seems pretty obvious, but you laugh. Some people don't realize that. That the early histories of those two colonies is very, very different. And in Maryland, the Anglican Church was not established until 1692, as opposed to Virginia. The minute that they stepped foot on that property, it was the Anglican Church. Anglicans are not Jesuits. Yet again, we have enough sins of our own. We don't need to claim theirs as well, all right? So governmental support of parishes ended in 1776. The establishment actually enacted governmental support for parishes. That's a much longer talk. Parish records are very spotty and incomplete, and many types of records no longer exist. As an archivist and a historian, I deal in facts, what I can find in primary sources. 1807 to 1808, the United States and Great Britain outlawed the Atlantic slave trade, but that doesn't mean that they outlawed slave trade within the United States and from the islands. April 1862, slavery is abolished in the District of Columbia. Some folks don't know that. And Maryland finally abolishes slavery in November 1864, because if you remember your history in the Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln outlawed slavery in the states that were in rebellion. Maryland was not in rebellion. Even though Southern Maryland was very pro-South, it did not secede from the Union. The Episcopal Diocese of Washington was created out of the Episcopal Diocese of Maryland in 1895. So history prior to is at the Episcopal Diocese of Maryland Archives in Baltimore. So if you are in a parish or church that exists prior to 1895, your early history is housed in Baltimore. And probably the nut here is the 8 parishes research that I've been contracted to research are the root of all current parishes in the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, and indicative of all Maryland parishes prior to 1864. We are of the same family. This is our DNA, like this gentleman over here was talking about. Next slide, please. So, who are we talking about? So the original 1692 parishes that now lie within EDOW. In St. Mary's County, it's William and Mary in Valley Lee, King and Queen in Chaptico, and All Faiths in Charlotte Hall. In Prince George's County, it's St. Paul's in Baden and Piscataway, and Piscataway Parish, which is now St. John's Broad Creek. Charles County, William and Mary, Pickawaxen, or Wayside Parish, Port Tobacco and La Plata, and Nanjemoy, which is Durham and Ironsides. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so the committee posed 3 questions for me to look into. Did any parish engage in slavery by owning enslaved persons or by participating in the sale or transportation of them? Did any parish benefit directly from slavery by the use of enslaved labor to work church lands, to erect church buildings, or through the sale of enslaved persons to fund church bequests? Did any parish benefit indirectly from slavery by receiving gifts, subsidies, or bequests from the wealth accumulated through the use of slave labor. All right, next slide, please. Okay, so as you might imagine, since the church was the arm of the colonial government, there are some really great governmental records, but as I was saying, actual parish records that still exist for vestry meetings, financial records are pretty much non-existent, quite frankly. So it's hard to track a lot of these things. But there are some conclusions here or some findings that we can share. So first of all, everyone, and I do mean everyone, whether they were an enslaver or not an enslaver, participated in an economy that was in part supported by enslaved labor. And so maybe an example I would put out for us today is, let's say you go buy that head of lettuce in the store. You are buying that head of lettuce, you are paying the store buys it from some grower or some middleman. Do we know, are they paying their laborers a fair wage? Are their laborers even being paid? Does it come from another country who enforces labor? All back to that head of lettuce. You are participating in that economy. So that's the simple, very simplistic example I'll give with that. The spiritual life of the enslaved was a concern, even if the church usually avoided debating the condition of enslavement. Typical Episcopalians, they had this really great way of just kind of going down that middle road, right? They were always saying, you know, be sure that you baptize the enslaved, et cetera, but they kind of skirted the idea of actually coming out in a moral way against it. And even in 1704, a law was passed in Maryland to ensure that baptism did not confer freedom. So yes, you think in our minds, it's like, what the heck were they thinking? Well, of course, as you read in the Gospels, that baptism will make you free, i.e. your soul, and you are free in Christ, right? Well, those planters got their knickers in a twist because they thought, oh my gosh, what happens if my enslaved think that that is a ticket to freedom? No. The legislature in 1704 actually had to codify that no, baptism did not confer freedom. Some priests committed to including the enslaved as a part of their ministry and offered baptism, confirmation, and marriage. And this is true for the entire time period to 1864. It varies, just like you might think, from parish to parish, depending on the priest that was in there, depending on the congregation. You have people like, I can speak to Reverend Gordon, who was in St. Thomas Parish during that time, actually made a very concerted effort to visit each plantation on a regular basis to confirm, to bury, to marry. And he actually kept these records in his book and had these little saddlebag, but that was a charge that he took very seriously, as did many others, and then some not so much, right? Let's see here. By law, enslaved were not to work on the Sabbath day. You hear that, so I just wanted to confirm that. Yes, indeed, that is the case. Enslaved persons did attend church services. The Reverend Giles Rainsford of St. Paul's Parish notes that one enslaved man was a constant communicant, and this is in 1724. And don't you just wish he had just gone the extra mile to tell us his name? But unfortunately, he did not. But this is also true for the time period researched 1864. Enslaved did come to church, whether they were accompanied by their enslavers or not. They were very much a part of the church. So let's go to the next slide. All right, question 1. Did any parish engage in slavery by owning enslaved persons or by participating in the sale or transportation of them? All right, so like I said, research is ongoing. I haven't covered the whole time period just yet. But to date, I have found only one instance of a parish actually owning and selling enslaved. December 1796, William and Mary Parish in Charles County was authorized by the Maryland General Assembly to sell the enslaved in their possession, and this is directly out of the act, and the money arising from such sales to invest in real or other property in their discretion for the use and benefit of the said parish. Well, there in a nutshell exactly what the Reverend Doctor was telling us at the beginning, right? Let's not put this money to education or anything else. Let's buy some more property because we know Episcopalians love our property, right? Some vestrymen and priests owned enslaved persons. That probably goes without saying. Of the 48 original vestrymen elected in 1692, they got 6 vestrymen per parish, was what was in the legislation. 20 of those 48 owned enslaved at the time of their deaths, a total of 307 enslaved persons, and on average 15 per vestryman. And the one place to find this out, if you are researching in your own parish, is probate records, wills, and that sort of thing. So that's where I get this figure from. It's at their death, not necessarily at the very time that they were elected to the vestry, but it does show that about 50%, maybe more, actually did own enslaved. It's just a little window that we have that can kind of guide us in our talk, right? All right, next slide, please. Okay, continuing on. Both Maryland commissaries, and a commissary was the representative of the Bishop of London. America had no bishops until after the Revolutionary War. So that's something to keep in mind. There was no oversight. So these commissaries were appointments by the Bishop of London, who was the tacit head of the church in America. Jacob Henderson, who took care of the Western Shore, and eventually upon the death of Christopher Wilkinson in 1729, took over all of Maryland, owned, enslaved, and held indentures, as did Christopher Wilkinson, his compatriot on the Eastern Shore. So Jacob Henderson, at his death, owned 22 enslaved and 1 indentured. Indentures were still going on. And I just thought in order to honor these people, I would put their names in today. We have Belinda, Bess, Daphne, Davy, Dick, Blind George, Hercules, New Jack, Jamie, Jerry, Kate, Nacy, a boy, Nan, Nell, Peg, Peter, Sam, Sue, Toby, Tom, Will, who was infirm, and Willard. And they ranged in age from 3-month-old Sue to 100-year-old Bess. That's amazing. Yeah, would that somebody had talked to her about her story, right? John, a white indenture, still had 2 years and 2 months left on his indenture, and Henderson had actually set old Jenny free in 1719. And Henderson was connected with St. Barnabas Church in Oak Grove in Prince George's County. He did serve a little time in St. Paul's. He was in Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. He had started there, but he saw better and greener times in Maryland, got rid of the SPG, came and got a parish in Maryland, and became a very wealthy man. Christopher Wilkinson owned at least 7 enslaved and indentured at his death. John Dorson, who was actually white, Jenny, Mull, Mary, Alfred, Little Tom, who was also white, Robin, who was mixed race, Shiloh, who was also mixed race, John Moore, and he once recommended all parishes be provided with glebes and houses with, quoting now, mulattoes, once the right of the church, being supplied as glebe servants and managers. And this was never instituted, I might say, but it was tradition. Next slide, please. Question 2. Did any parish benefit directly from slavery by the use of enslaved labor to work church lands, erect church buildings, or through the sale of enslaved persons to fund church bequests? Yes, and, right? This is complicated, as vestrymen occasionally allowed their enslaved to act as sextons, laborers, or to do labor for the parish. And sometimes this work was done for pay, sometimes not. But absent any detailed financial records, we do not know if any of those payments were allowed to be kept by the enslaved or given to the enslaver. The records research to date indicated that it was on a case-by-case basis, but simply, yes, enslaved were used on occasion for church work. For the sale of enslaved persons, see answer to question 1, which we just talked about. And just to elaborate on that one just a little bit more is, unfortunately, the records for William and Mary Parish, Pickawaxen, only begin in 1864. They were destroyed during the Civil War. So unfortunately, I cannot find out either the name or what did happen to those individuals, because they're not named in the legislation at the assembly level. Sad. Question 3, please. Next slide. All right, question 3. Did any parish benefit indirectly by slavery, from slavery, by receiving gifts, subsidies, or bequests from the wealth accumulated through the use of slave labor. Yes, again, it's a bit harder to track due to the lack of records. And I would say, no doubt, wealth accumulated by enslavement certainly made its way into parish coffers one way or the other, right? Whether it be in the plate on Sundays. But you do have to remember that after 1776, the church was on its own. It was not legislated anymore to send pounds of tobacco to the parish to pay the priest. So prior to that, there was no, you didn't pass the plate on Sundays, because you could always petition the legislature for more tobacco to build your new church, buy some more communion wine, fix the cemetery. The priest got 40 pounds of tobacco per pole, and there's a big formula to that. That is why Maryland priests were some of the best paid priests in colonial America. And in fact, Maryland, by the mid-1700s, was the place that any priest wanted to come. Because, think about it, as the population grew, so did your salary. There was no cap. In Virginia, they were smart. They put a cap. You could only make up to 1,700 pounds or 17,000 pounds a year. Maryland, there was no cap on it. So that is why, if you look back at our colonial priesthood, you know, some of them got very wealthy. And let's see. All right, I think that is it. Next slide. So, Peter, are we taking questions now, or are we just moving on? What do we think? Anybody? Somebody? He's coming.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I'm not.
Yeah. Franklin, we can take a few questions right now.
We can.
Yeah.
Okay.
Two to three questions, and then we'll segue to lunch.
Yes, sir. Right here in the front.
Perhaps I missed it, but were not slaves used to actually build the buildings, lay the bricks for the cement and so forth?
All right. So the answer to that is okay. The question was, were not the enslaved used to build the churches, lay the bricks, and that sort of thing? Absent any detailed records, it is a guess. And of course, archivists and historians don't like to guess. But you can probably be pretty sure that yes, on some of our colonial churches, I am sure that enslaved worked. Unfortunately, we don't have the details in the sense of, you know, in St. Thomas Parish, we're very lucky because we actually have the original contract with Daniel Page. But it doesn't say, it just says he's contracted to build this church. Now, when I researched Daniel Page, he owned enslaved, about 8, but none of the ones that are in his will and his probate records when he dies would be old enough to have worked on the building. That doesn't mean that he didn't have some that worked on the building. So yes, I think it is a safe assumption that yes, some certainly did. Yes, sir, there, and then over there.
My research has shown that often when enslaved persons were used for constructing the church, that they often surreptitiously put their finger marks in the bricks that they were creating and in foundation locations. Like, so if you carefully look at the foundation of your church or the wall, you may see the mark of slaves there.
All right, very good. Thank you. And what parish are you, sir?
St. John's, Georgetown.
Ah, okay, very good. Thank you. Lady, and then back over here, okay? And then I think we need to have to go.
Can you talk a little bit about the access that enslaved people had to Eucharist?
Yes, well, all right, yet again, sad to say, I have not come across, I'm not saying it's not there, it's just maybe I haven't found it yet, right? About, you know, who allowed communion, who did not. So the way that it was worked in, at least in St. Thomas during Father Gordon's time, was that he would take communion to the enslaved on the plantations. Now, in talking to our older African-American parishioners, it was unspoken tradition that white people went to the communion rail first, black people went after them. So that's how I can speak to that. Yes, sir, over here.
Were the royal indentures white, and could they work their freedom out in short order, like in New York State?
Okay, so the question was, were the indentures, could they work their time out? Yes, indeed, that was what an indenture was. You were indentured usually for 7 years. And at the end of 7 years, which is an interesting thought, is that you would get an axe and a hoe, 40 pounds of corn, and then you would also be able to patent 40 acres of land. So would that they had done that in 1864 to kind of redress these reparations, right? So, but unfortunately it didn't happen. So
Those were whites as well as blacks.
Only until enslavement was made legal. And in Maryland, it was legal much later than in Virginia. So that's why I say you really have to look into the records, because we have actually the first African American to sit in a legislature was in Maryland in the 1600s. Matthias D'Souza, maybe you've heard of him, but unfortunately he drops from the records. We don't know, did he pass, did he move on somewhere else, but it is noted, and we do know that he was a man of color. He sat in the legislature, had voice and vote because he had property. So sad to say, Maryland was on the right track, but then it got their head turned, you know? Yes, Rudy, are we done?
Yeah.
All right, very good. Thank you all so much, appreciate it.
Once again, Franklin, thank you for the invaluable research and work that you put into this, and this data to help us, wrestle with the material implications of the diocese's involvement in slavery on a deeper level. So with that being said, we're actually going to segue to lunch. So sit tight, enjoy the fellowship, and your table will be called to the table in the back where all of the food will be stored. So thank you.
He was so proud that after he left St. John's, he wrote a book in 1901 entitled Old Plantation, How We Lived in the Great House and Cabin Before the War, which, according to Wikipedia, was written as a response to Uncle Tom's Cabin. Much later in 2011, while reading some of the early letters written by the rector in 1919, the Reverend James Kirkpatrick, I became quite upset as his writings were very appalling. His words were full of hatred for many different groups, for instance, Catholics, especially the Pope, anyone of color, immigrants, etc. To say that I was shocked would be a gross understatement. I went to my rector, the Reverend Dr. Sarah-Atik, and had a long talk asking for guidance, as I didn't feel I could continue working in the archives. He was very thoughtful and asked me to consider the time period in which it was written and reminded me that it was the feeling of the entire country at the time. He asked me to continue my work. So I continued learning firsthand about the history of St. John's by reading more of the files in the archives. In December 2018, I gave a very whitewashed history of the parish, which was well received. However, I kept digging into the founders of the parish and discovered that all of those who had signed the deed were enslavers. At about this time, fellow parishioner Jay Malin approached me with more information on enslavers, which he had found while doing research for a documentary he was doing about 3 lynchings in Montgomery County. We were both appalled at what we were finding. Jay's foundings were that there were covenants and other exclusionary methods in the surrounding area which forbade Jews, Middle Easterners, and colored people from buying in the area of Chevy Chase, and that the neighborhood was founded by an unabashed racist, Senator Newlands. After some prayer, more reading, and gathering of information, I felt that the story of the racial intolerance in our early history needed to be told. In January 2020, with Sari's blessing, I shared what I had learned with the parish in a joint presentation with Jay. I had written articles in our newsletter to let people know what I would be talking about. Consequently, there seemed to be no surprise at what I told them, but there were lots of questions. The main question was, when did this attitude change, as it obviously has changed at St. John's? I have no definitive answer, just that over time, as in our country, Attitudes have changed for the better, but there is lots of work still to be done. Others have thanked me for what I have found and for sharing this information. I have also given a presentation to Bethesda Historical Society, which had basically the same reaction. Discovering the truth of our founding was and still is a difficult matter to deal with. The fact that slavery was accepted as the norm is not okay. The money that established our church to be was tainted money. The worst part for me is that those feelings of hatred for a group of God's people were accepted as normal by the church at St. John's and in the Diocese of Maryland and then Washington. There have been a lot of changes at St. John's over the years. Our first African-American associate rector, the Reverend Janice Robinson, served from 1988 to 1995, and she was much loved. Others have followed as associate rector, senior warden, and members of the vestry. All are welcome now at St. John's as we continue to hope for changes in the hearts of all.
Okay, all right. We do understand that all of our congregations are at different points in this work. Some of you may have a very deep knowledge of your congregation's history. Some of you may just be finding out. And as Franklin has mentioned to us many times over, some of us think we have a very clear picture of the story of our congregations, but what we've actually received is a great deal of mythology. And there's a process of demythologization that comes through learning this history. One of the things that I hope that you heard in Kathy's testimonial is that this process of facing and engaging and uncovering the history of our congregations, exactly as Dean Douglas described to us, is part of this step of the process of repairing the breach between the people as we are now and the people that God is calling us to be. That there's an internal process of, one could say, confession and repentance that comes with uncovering and telling the stories of our communities. And we want to invite you to take part in that. There's going to be obviously a great deal of work if you want to do it with a great deal of seriousness, but we want to invite you just to begin thinking about it now. So we know that some folks are still eating lunch. We're going to give you about 15 or 20 minutes to discuss the set of questions that you can find on page 5, where it says, where does my community fit into this historical picture? You don't need to follow the process because some of you are still having lunch, but we just want to invite you within your tables to try and think about the history of your congregation, what you know, and where your blind spots might be. So some questions you might want to think about are to think about the racial demographics of your congregation and the neighborhood surrounding it. Who is there at worship every week? And who is missing? Who lives in the neighborhood around your congregation? And who does not live in the neighborhood around your congregation? Does your congregation look like its surrounding neighborhood or not? And when you think about this, about the way your congregation looks, the way the neighborhood around it looks, do you know why it is the way it is? I think one of the crucial pieces that I took away from Dean Douglas's talk this morning is that there is always this discourse that causes us to believe that the way things are simply the way things are. That there are structures of power that have shaped it, that shape our congregations and their neighborhoods. So consider the question, do you know why your congregation looks the way it does? Do you know why the neighborhood around it looks the way it does? And then ask some other questions about, do you know what do you know about the founding of your congregation? Why was it founded? Where did the first members come from? Where did the funds to start your congregation come from? And these may give you the kind of beginning questions that you might need to begin investigating that history. So I just want to invite you, as well as you are able, next 15 minutes or so, in open format in your tables, to share your answers to those questions. Thank you.
Yeah, when they start laying the brick.
Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
very clear listening in also that this section we're doing right now could go for another 20 minutes, hour. But we did promise to get you out of here by 3 o'clock. So we are going to continue on. We're going to hear right now from another one of our congregational research partners, a congregation very near and dear to my heart, Calvary Episcopal Church, where you are right now. Rick, can you cue up that video for us?
Morning. My name is Tony Schooler. I am a parishioner. Morning. My name is Tony Schooler. I am a parishioner at Calvary Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C., under the leadership of Reverend Peter Schell. The Reparation Project started about 6 or 7 months ago, led by Dr. Sylvia King, who is also a parishioner at Calvary. Reparation was something that I really had to research to get my hands on what came before, because most of what I had been taught about Calvary and its history, I think I can say was kind of sugar-coated. I had no idea the obstacles that had to be overcome for Calvary to grow and thrive. Some of these things were that we were told that the bishop called Reverend Bennett to establish Calvary, but we weren't told that when Reverend Bennett wanted to establish a church in an area where there were African-American homeowners, as opposed to areas when they were shanties, he was not given any funds to build his mission. He was given a salary, but no funds. And so basically he found his own donors. He searched through excess things in all the other churches so he could get his church up and running. That had to do with the location of the church. The other thing is Reverend Bennett was in charge not only of Calvary, but also of St. Philip's, Atonement, Woodville, and Crohn's. And he had to get to those places on his own. No transportation was given to him. And whenever he didn't meet the date and time he was supposed to be there, he was chastised, even though he often was wet and had to sleep on bare floors and things like that. Calvary also did not have electricity. And so we had to borrow money from the diocese to get electricity installed. This was back in, I think in the 1917 or 19, I don't remember the date exactly. Also, the other thing is that we never were a parish. Even though Calvary was founded in 1901, we were never given the option of being a parish, and we never had a vestry until 1940. That is a long time, even though our financial system was well. During the time I was trying to research what actually went on in terms of any prejudice or discrimination to Calvary, I went through the archives of the Diocese of Washington. I looked through Reverend Bennett's personal papers at the Payne Library at Virginia Theological Institute. I looked at the notes on the Committee of Colored Work and other assorted documents. And this kind of gave me a feel for what Reverend Bennett was up against. It was interesting to note that Calvary was listed as a mission and put under the Committee on Colored Work as though we were in a foreign land. That to me was astounding. I always felt that we were Americans, so why were we treated like a mission? Reverend Bennett was quite outstanding, as he was recognized in the District of Columbia as a member of the Selective Service Board. And he was also on the Board of Education for DC. He was elected to that position many times. I've not seen that happen in terms of African-American churches, but I'm not sure. Maybe that was just something that happened that I wasn't aware of. Reverend Bennett started a lot of programs that helped to elevate the status of African Americans, which was industrial training, libraries, credit unions, academic education. And some of the things that showed what he was up against were statements like it was hard to keep one's enthusiasm in the face of a spirit which lynches manhood without enthusiasm. No man can do an honest work. The church compromises the lynching spirit of Georgia and South Carolina and cannot be under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. A wave of prejudice, which is sweeping over the church, causes one to feel almost homeless. He also stated in another letter to one of the bishops that he had forgotten the fact of his being a Negro and how it implicated the things that happened in terms of his church. And that he didn't feel that the colored African Americans, Blacks, were given the respect by the church that they gave to Chinese and to the Indians. My feeling is that for reparation, money really doesn't, I mean, it's nice, but it doesn't solve problems. You can't keep money. But if you're educated, you can always keep the knowledge that you've learned. And with the Episcopal Church here having National Cathedral School for Girls, St. Albans, Beauvoir, I think that if one form of reparation for Calvary, even though we're a church without many children, could be looking at the community, particularly the school that is very close to our heart, J.O. Wilson, maybe finding students that have a lot of potential, maybe don't have the grade point average, and bringing them into the Episcopal schools, providing mentors for them, giving them tutoring, helping them with food and lodging and transportation, and structuring it somewhat along the lines that they've done in the Bishop Walker School for Boys, but within the overall confines of the very elitist schools at the cathedral. I think we could look at Georgetown University and Harvard University to see how they actually structured their education programs. Even though some of those were directed toward the descendants of slaves. These are the things that I learned. It was just astounding. I don't think I can ever forget. My eyes have opened wide now to what happened in the Episcopal Church. And I look forward to working with the church to try to rectify some of these things in some manner that would be beneficial to all. Thank you.
So just a couple points, just to make a couple connections between the work of Calvary's Historical Committee and what Tony presented and what we heard earlier today from Dean Douglas. I hope you heard in the story she was telling you about how this discursive power of an assumption of an inferior and second-class place for the Black congregations at every stage, in some places very explicitly in terms of words he heard, were sabotaging Reverend Bennett's efforts to found a community here in this place. It also highlights for us the ways that this diocese as an institution has been complicit in generating that white supremacist discourse that has sabotaged so many Black Americans here in this area. And the last piece I wanted you to notice was that Tony made at the end that shift from acknowledging, recognizing these truths towards trying to breach that gap between the world as it is and the kingdom of God. And she did it very explicitly in the terms that Dean Douglas described, in terms of saying this might not be for Calvary, but it may be possible for us to imagine and bring into being a better future and better possibility for the generations that are following us. And she is doing that imaginative work of trying to think, which is an imaginative work because we know the world as it is. And we're trying to reach towards the kingdom of God, of seeing what might be possible. So in that spirit, I just want to give you a quick sense of where we are in terms of our next steps and this resolution that we will bring before convention in January. We are not going to present the text of the resolution right now. And the reason for that is we are still working on drafting it. We have a number of partners that we're working with in discussing the matter with. The Union of Black Episcopalians, the Task Force on Black Ministries, our own accountability board. We've been working with all of them, and they have brought many suggestions to the table of how they want this resolution to be shaped, what it should speak to, and what it should try to accomplish. But I can give you the broad strokes, and I can promise you that later this month, we will be publishing a draft resolution. You'll be able to get your eyes on it. And then, at the regional gatherings, you will have an opportunity to kind of offer feedback on it. We really want, as we're coming in to convention, to have the resolution be as clear and as strong as possible, with as much sense of feedback and input from the diocese at large and this whole area of the DC area. But broadly, there are 3 steps in the resolution. The first one is simply an acknowledgement, and you've been hearing part of that today already, laying out what it is that we do know about this history. We understand that there are many unknowns, many stories that we're still uncovering, but what we do know about this history of anti-Black racist harms and sabotage, laying it out. And then secondarily, because we are Episcopalians and we like to do things by the prayer book, following the rite of repentance and reconciliation, of making a confession, to say that we did, in fact, as an institution, whether we were personally involved or not, in our sins of omission and commission, we took part in this. Bishop Budde reminded me of some words that Bishop Sutton in Maryland said recently. Sometimes we might be able to say accurately because we inherit these institutions. We did not do it, but we are responsible. I would push a little bit on that sometimes because I think it's important in terms of that reparative work that Dean Douglas was talking about, to recognize the things that we do in our own lives, the ways we do participate. So there will be a confession, and there will be a statement of repentance, an acknowledgement that we need to examine the structures of the diocese to make sure that we are, in fact, turning away from these harms, and we're not continuing to perpetuate them. And the third piece will be a step towards restitution, to say these harms have been inflicted, and in as far as is possible, we must offer restitution and repair. We're going to lay that out in fairly open terms, because I hope you've heard already, and you'll hear it when if you check out Dr. Kane West's report. The concept of what reparations could look like is broad and diverse. It includes financial resources, it includes volunteer time and commitment, it includes reshaping our institutions, it includes removing barriers and creating opportunities. There are many ways we could go about this work, and we don't want to narrow in too quickly. So instead, what this resolution would do is form a working group that over the course of the coming year would look at the question and say, what is the appropriate response from the diocese? What are our targets? What resources are we committing financially, in terms of space, in terms of volunteer time, all of these pieces, and how are we going to make a process of actually moving that process of restitution forward? How are we going to offer out these resources and not go over them? A principal concern that I would say has come up from all the groups, from UBE, the Black Task Force on Black Ministries, and our accountability board, is the question of representation on that working group. Who's laying out the plan of how we're going to do this? One question that has come up repeatedly in this work is, and again you heard Dean Douglas allude to it, is the question is, what is the difference between reparations work and charity, right? They both involve letting go of resources in a certain way. And that question is complicated, but an essential piece that showed up again and again is the question of who is at the table making the decision. If the community that has been harmed is part of the process of deciding how this will move forward and saying this is what we need, this is what we are owed, and this is how it should be laid forth, it is more likely that you're engaged in the process of reparations. If the community that's been harmed is not at the table, it is almost certain that what you are doing is charity. And so in that process of representation on this policy working group, we want to make sure that we are bringing the folks to the table who need to be there to make sure that we are setting up the agenda properly. So again, you'll see that information. You'll get a chance to look at it. You'll get a chance to respond back, both at the regional gatherings, and I hope I'm not speaking out of place here, Bishop, but in the past, for convention, we've had listening sessions on the resolutions. So there will also be listening sessions where whether you're a delegate or not, you'll have an opportunity to speak and get voice heard. And we encourage you to do that. But with that, I want now, we've given you so much information. We want to begin getting your minds thinking imaginatively about what next steps might be and how we might move forward. And we have a particular process we're going to do to get that to happen. And so I'd like to invite, have I missed is there a video? No, there's not, the video comes next. Rudy, I'd like to invite Rudy Logan, the Commissioner for Equity and Justice, to come up and give us some norms and lay out the process that we're going to use for this next step.
So before we go into this question verse exercise, I just have to say I've been a part of some really deep, meaningful conversations. And I don't feel like I have to reiterate extensively about norms, but rather to encourage us to keep having these conversations in the spirit of generosity, kindness, and creativity. To go back to Dr. Douglas's remarks earlier, how are we orienting ourselves towards God's future, the divine justice? But the question verse exercise can be especially helpful with a deep and complicated matter like reparations. It can be easy to be consumed with technical questions and challenges, but this question verse process is going to help us think creatively and orient us towards possibilities we might not have considered otherwise. And by answering the big questions before us, let us cross-pollinate these questions I have, the deep questions that we have, as we explore concrete solutions. So the challenge and the question is, what would it mean and require for the Diocese of Washington and its congregants to make reparations for the harms of racism? What would it mean and require for the Diocese of Washington and its congregants to make reparations for the harms of racism? So just write down a few of your words describing your emotional temperature. And on the sheet provided by the symposium packet, jot that in that section there. And for 4 minutes, just ask questions that have been inspired by this challenge. Don't answer any question. Don't have any explanations. Just continue asking questions. And write down each question word for word on a verbatim sheet included on the packet provided to you on tape. For the facilitators, ask each group member to write down a few words describing their emotional temperature about the challenge after doing the question verse provided in the sheet. Ask each group member to look at the list of questions and identify one that compels them to action. Get up, get out, and seek new questions and answers to generate the solutions that justice demands. Then, have your group members share one question that compels them to action. Ask whether it's possible for the group to identify one question out of the group's choices the most critical to ask, and why that question is important. We will maintain record of each question the group has chosen and use it to discern new pathways as we explore solutions to the question of reparations. Okay, yeah. Are people okay with the process? Are you clear about that, facilitators? Good. I believe it's in the packet provided, the instructions. Yeah, page 6.
How much time do we have?
I think the guidelines in the packet of materials that was sent to everybody beforehand said 4 minutes for this part of it to think about questions that this challenge brings up for you. Once you get into your Zoom room,
What is the best possible course of action besides the best possible social media? That makes sense. Because there's some, like even like people saying there's so many ways to do it. What is the
Which I think will come out of Canon's report. What do we do?
How do we document this process? The archivist, yeah.
Hey, excuse me, if I can have everybody's attention. Now we'll take 3 questions from the audience. And remember, think about the question that strikes at the heart of the challenge statement. What would it mean and require for the Diocese of Washington and its congregants to make reparations for the harms of racism? And we'll have the mobile microphone passed around. Is there anybody who would like to go first with their questions? Please don't rush. Okay, right here. Oh.
The first question from Margaret is this going to need to be a sacrificial type of commitment? Again?
Can you repeat that, please?
It can mean many things. The question needs to be explored. But does it have to be a sacrificial type of commitment?
Right, and remember, we're not answering questions. So. And continue to write questions if you have questions to these questions. Oh, and we have someone right over here. Can we come towards the front, please? Oh, right here. Right here.
What inequities were created by years of injustice, and how can we address them in reparations?
Hey, back room. Okay, we'll take your question too. Yeah.
One of our questions is, what does structural justice look like for EDAO? And parenthetically, what does it look like and how is that different for churches of color, historically Black churches, who are carrying debts such as building debts that are tied to their history?
Any questions? Yep.
question is, how does this discernment process become part of our Christian formation?
One of our questions was, do we need to reorganize our common life in some way that resources across congregations are more equally distributed so that we don't continue to participate in this type of oppressive narrative?
And could you pass the microphone to the gentleman beside you at the table here?
At great risk. It seems to me that the question is really too narrow. I think the problem is much larger than we set it forth here. I would suggest that we start thinking in terms of launching a long-term, well-planned, multimedia program, by time if necessary, perhaps on public television, to have panel discussions and speakers to talk to the nation and get feedback on what we're really talking about. Because it's my feeling that the vast majority of people, certainly the white population, but I suspect also the black population, isn't really on board with the idea of reparations. People feel guilty about the idea of taking someone else's money, unearned money, and other people feel uncomfortable. What they think is, because if they think in terms of money, we speak of reparations. And but if you think in terms of resources or other types of resources, time, institutions, it's an enormous, it's a revolutionary concept, I think. And it seems to me that at some point we need to start thinking of the magnitude of the challenge we're talking about.
Okay, so what I'm hearing from you is it would be meaningful of our time to cultivate a robust media platform that can help address these myths, these falsehoods about reparations. Like going back to Dr. Douglas' remarks, you know, how do we change the narrative? How do we provide a different kind of justification that seeks to do justice? And we will take two more. Oh. We'll take three. Yeah.
Sort of a variety of questions combined by us was essentially, can we reach everyone, even in the Episcopal Diocese of Washington, which is very economically, racially, geographically, theologically diverse? Can we reach everyone, even in our own diocese? And if so, how do we go about that?
I guess a variation on that would be, and bring it in a process way, in a much smaller scale than the gentleman just addressed. What number or percentage of us need to be committed to this work of reparations in order to create the necessary tipping point for us to be able to act as a diocese?
Our table had more of an internal examination as opposed to a direct question for, or direct statement for the diocese. So a few of those were the component of, are we all bringing honesty to the conversation? Are we just lip service? And a second one was, and we've all gone through this, is making sure that the spaces that we are having discussions with are safe spaces for people to bravely and honestly say what they're feeling. And one that resonated with me is how do we break the cycle of being, you know, nice white people, which we all tend to think we are before we get
make sure that we're openly listening to what is being said. Table?
These are a few questions from online. How do we find consensus that is needed to move forward as a diocese? And how do we define that consensus? How do we not compound pain, but encourage healing? And what does healing look like?
Just want to commend you all for just sitting with these questions. I know with an issue such as this, it can be so quick for us to, come up with solutions. Such a complicated matter. And I encourage you going forward to sit with these questions you have and to study it on your own time and explore how your questions can be a part of this collective conversation about how we go forward and model a program of reparations within UW. So with that being said, we will have a final word from Bishop Mariann.
One more video. And then
One more, okay, I'm sorry. One more video and then a word from Bishop Mariann.
Preparation for sharing our findings with our parish. We shared our first story, where our land came from, this past month at Grace, and also created a visual display, which you see behind me here and on the wall today at the symposium at Calvary Episcopal Church. When we presented the first story to the parish, no one expressed surprise. Lloyd Beckett, Alice Brown, Basil Brown, Margaret Brown, Samuel Brown, Frank Brown, Maria Brown, Joseph Brown, Eliza Brown, James Brown, William Brown, Mary Brown, Charles Brown, Robert Brown, Lucy Clark, Henry Coquire, David Diggs, James Gant, Jasper Poole, Richard Proctor, Sarah Sims, Maria Sims, James Sims, Hanson Smith, Lucy Whitaker, Moses Whitaker, Samuel Williams, and 13 additional unnamed human beings ranging in age from 2.5 years old to 63. These are the men, women, and children enslaved by founders of Grace Church, Silver Spring. These human beings suffered under the institution of chattel slavery. Please take a moment of silence to honor their lives. Hi, my name is Susan Shulkin, and I'm a founding member of the Reparations Task Force for the Diocese of Washington, as well as leader of the Parish History of Race and Racism team at Grace Episcopal Church in Silver Spring, Maryland. Starting 1 year ago this month, a team of volunteers at Grace began to research the early history of our church from its founding in 1855 through 1875 in a way it's never been done before. We're lucky in that we have what was considered to be a comprehensive history of our church through the 1950s, with an update published in the 1970s. But when our team studied these documents, we quickly realized, not surprisingly, that they centered the experiences of white people in our parish history. In fact, the author of our original history once made it very clear how she felt about the status of enslaved people. In a newsletter for the Montgomery County Historical Society in 1968, she wrote, "There once stood on Hanover Street a large house. An owner in the 1920s related that it contained a small bricked up cellar room with a slit of a window at the top. Fastened to the floor was a ball and chain, probably used to punish recalcitrant slaves." Recalcitrant slave, recalcitrant. definition having an obstinately uncooperative attitude, because obviously the proper demeanor for an enslaved person would be passive and cooperative. And this is the person who wrote our original parish history. So our team first established a mission for ourselves to reconsider the history of Grace Church by identifying and centering the consequences of slavery and the contributions of Black Americans in the story we tell ourselves about who we are as a parish. Then we started to work. Some of us dug through the existing archival material that we could find at Grace. Others began scouring census information and digitized newspapers on the internet and consulting with historians who had already done research into the Silver Spring area during this 20-year period, both before and after the Civil War. And one of our members discovered a census of enslaved people in Montgomery County, a census compiled after the Civil War in hopes that enslavers could receive reparations for their lost property. Over time, we compiled and consolidated and rechecked our sources in preparation for sharing our findings with our parish. We shared our first story, where our land came from, this past month at Grace, and also created a visual display, which you see behind me here and on the wall today at the symposium at Calvary Episcopal Church. When we presented the first story to the parish, no one expressed surprise. As a community, we've already journeyed together through the removal of a Confederate battle flag in a stained glass window in 2017, and the vandalism and destruction of a Confederate monument in the parish cemetery days after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. This past weekend, a number of visitors attended a reception in our Undercroft at Grace, and many took time to read the story and look at the exhibits posted on the wall. According to our rector, several of them approached her and said, "This is a great thing that you're doing at your church, to tell the truth about your history. We wish our churches would do the same." So here is your opportunity. If you are interested in learning more about your church's entanglements with race and racism through the years, now is a great time to start. The task force is here for you to offer resources, guidance, and support as you begin this journey.
So we are now coming towards the end of our time together. And just as we close out, I'm going to invite the bishop up for the final address in a moment. But before we do, I wanted to talk a little bit about some next steps and also to offer some words of thanks. A couple pieces I do want you to have on your radar. As I mentioned, the regional gatherings are coming up. Before then, we will have to you the draft text of the resolution. We encourage you to look it over. If you are a delegate or a warden, you'll be invited to attend these gatherings, and we'd like you to make your voice heard, offer us critique, feedback, and support, we hope, for this work. If you are not a warden or a delegate, we want you to get in touch with the warden or delegate at your congregation and encourage them to take part as well. Another thing you might be able to do is to bring this information that you've learned today back to your congregations. We're going to be sending every participant, we've got your email, an email including all of the resources we've shared today, the pieces we weren't able to get to, the role-playing exercise we mentioned, the various videos you've seen here, as well as the 2-week curriculum that we've set up that you can use in your parish context. So there's a lot of options and opportunities you'll have there to share this information back with your congregation. We really want you to take that charge up. Find out who the Christian education director in your congregation is and say, we'd like to make this a priority. And then, just as Susan mentioned, if you are interested in doing that work of really digging into the history of your congregation, email us at reparations@edow.org, and we will help get you in touch with people who have done this work, who know how to begin this process step by step and continue your way forward, and they can actually help support you all the way through. So there's a lot of possibilities for your continued engagement here, and we're going to keep you updated as more things become available. And then I do just want to thank everybody who made today possible. I'm just going to mention folks by group. I apologize, but I'm really, really grateful to all of the members of Church House staff that supported us greatly in this work and helped carry us through the end. In particular, the Missioner for Equity and Justice, Rudy Logan, who you mentioned, heard speak before, who just did incredible work. And this is not going to come off without his support. I want to thank all of the members of the Reparations Task Force who have been working at this for months to organize and get this together and get it off the ground. Our table facilitators who jumped in at the last minute, who we advised, I think, only 2 days ago that we wanted them to do this, and they stepped in and they said, okay. I want to thank our IT crew from Steel Beach Productions, Rick Blake, I want to thank Gwen Joy Catering Service for providing our meal. I'm almost done. Our sexton, Howard Moore, who had everything together and made sure that we were kind of together as we were moving forward. Our presenters, the folks who, the Congregational Research Cohort who put together the videos. Of course, our speaker who's now gone home, Reverend Dr. Kelly Brown Douglas. I know we're all blessed there. And you. I want to thank you. This morning, as we were hearing news of the storm spinning off of the hurricane coming in, we were all basically thinking, okay, we're going to be talking to 15 people, mostly 15. And there are more people here than registered. You showed up in force. You shared honestly. We're really, really grateful. And with that, I would like to invite the bishop to the stage.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you all. This is a quote from Bishop Michael Curry. It's on the front of the Episcopal Church website. Being a Christian is not essentially about joining a church or being a nice person, but about following in the footsteps of Jesus, taking his teachings seriously, letting his Spirit take the lead in our lives, and in so doing, helping to change the world from our nightmare into God's dream. I see that as part of what this work is about. It's rooted in Jesus and our desire to follow him and his spirit of truth, and then to do as we are called. Sometimes a really challenging work to help transform the world as it is into, as Dr. Douglas said, God's preferred future, God's preferred present. And sometimes that involves looking back on where we've been, not simply for the exercise of doing it, but for recognizing how that, where we've come from, has informed us in ways that we may or may not have ever known. One of the more sobering statistics about our country for people like me who are white is that very few of us, statistically speaking, and I don't know what the number is, but very few of us can say honestly that we have friends that are black or people of color. We just don't socialize with people who don't look in some way like us. Now that was true, more true of my life in Minnesota than it was here, than it is here, because I served a church in Minnesota that was located in the predominantly white corner of Minneapolis. Now, as we all know from the, when George Floyd put Minneapolis on the map, Minneapolis is one of the most segregated cities in the country, and there was and is a very significant black population, and that population had all kinds of trauma impacted through things like redlining, putting in the highway system, all the stories that we could say from other parts of the country. But what it did to me, what happened to me in my years of parenting and running a church is I just didn't have any black friends. I didn't. And I knew it. And it felt awful. But you sort of can't go around to people and say, will you be my friend? I just knew that I had a lot of work to do. And several of you were mentioning, we were talking about native plants, and of course in the Midwest, particularly in Minnesota, the issues with native populations is as close to the surface there as enslavement is here. So it's just right there, you just go back 100 years, and all the same issues of amnesia, we don't teach it in our schools, all of that is of course true. And the migration of people coming up from more southern parts of our continent. When I came to Washington, one of the things that was immediately gifted to me was the opportunity to be an authentic, trusting, covenanted Christian relationship with such a tremendous diversity of people across the spectrum of race and culture. It is one of the most challenging aspects of being a part of this diocese or leading this diocese in my role, but it is clearly one of the greatest gifts. And we have an opportunity as a diocese to take what has been given to us, all the good, all the struggle, all the hidden sin, all the people who have come before us who have really tried to do good in their time, right? Across every spectrum, as well as every way that we failed. And as Kelly said earlier, and by the way, when Kelly told me that she considered, she knows I'm her bishop, but she also, she's allowed me to be her friend, right? And I tell you, it is no easy thing to be the friend of Kelly Brown Douglas. She'll call me up and she'll say, Mariann, we've got to do something. But that's what a friend is, right? So, where was I going with this? Honest relationships, to take the moment that is ours. I didn't see this coming, I'll be honest with you. I didn't see the reparations work unfolding here, and I didn't know what that meant. I was seeing it in other places, New York, and a little bit about what's happening in Maryland, but it wasn't surfacing, and I didn't surface it, right? I didn't, to my shame. But one day, Peter called me and he said, Bishop, there's this group of us, and we've started this little study group. And I can't even remember what you asked me, Peter, but I just remember, I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, here it is. Here it is, the seed to get us started. Now, what I know about the Diocese of Washington is if we had put a resolution forward that year, it would have passed. It would have passed. Because we have a lot of white guilt in this diocese. We have a lot of white liberal guilt, right? Don't we? And we have some very empowered black leaders who have really worked hard over the last 3 bishops to get what they wanted when they wanted it. I mean, yes, am I right? I mean, so I knew that we had an empowered black population and a guilty white population, right? And then a whole bunch of other people who were asleep at the wheel and who probably didn't think it was a good idea, but they wouldn't feel empowered to speak about it because it is the Diocese of Washington, right? But we had an opportunity, following the lead of the Diocese of Maryland, to go slow and to go deep. To go slow and to go deep. And we're still in the going slow, we're in steep part. And we have, I don't know what the number is, but it's in the high double digits of, or at least 20, 30, somewhere in there, of congregations who are undertaking seriously their history. At least that many, if not more, who have undertaken sacred ground or some equivalent in real racial consciousness raising. So we're going slow and we're going deep. And I have every confidence that whatever the resolution looks like in January, it will pass because it's who we are. But it will be informed by all of the questions generated around these tables and other questions besides, giving as many of us the opportunity to engage and to understand why. And then we'll do our best to learn from the lessons of those who were braver to go first than we were, right? And that's what our presenter would have given us a little taste of. We've got plenty of time to catch up on that. Let's learn the lessons from the places where that have tried this. And as someone said, the places where the people who were meant to be the beneficiaries were really glad they did it, and the places where they wish they'd never started, right? So, I mean, it kind of cuts both ways. But you hear what I'm saying? Just to learn and to go. There's no getting off this train once you've gotten on it. There's no getting off. And we have a lot to learn. But I commit to you my heart and soul to this work. I was a slow adopter to this idea of reparations. The first time I heard white supremacy, I cringed and I said, we don't have to go there. Right? To my shame, I say that. And it was during my episcopate, right? Kim, I think you were the one who first sent it to me. And I was like, President Sandy, we want to talk about white supremacy. I don't want to talk about white supremacy. It was probably 9 years ago, 8 years ago, right? These are hard words and they hit you hard if you're a white person. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me, I'm just saying it's a process. And I'm committed to let that process unfold. Will everyone come on board with us? No. And there are lots of people on all sides of the spectrum who don't think reparations is the way to go. They don't. And that's okay, and we need to learn from them and to listen and to decide what that has to say to us. Right? But as a diocese, I am more than persuaded that this will be definitive, it will be sacrificial, and it needs to have, as I think Ledley's question, it needs to have enough support behind us so that it isn't simply a transfer of money that most of us didn't even know we had. Right? It has to be relational and transformative. And I believe that just based on what I've seen today and what I've witnessed in this process, that it will happen. Which doesn't mean it's going to be easy. And I've already had a few conversations with people who are, you know, they're just like where I was when this whole conversation started for me, and I get that. But so one thing I'll close with, and this is again something that Michael Curry has taught me, and he writes very honestly in his book Love is the Way about his own coming to understanding of what it means to be fully inclusive of LGBTQ plus people. And he writes as a Black man in the church, raised in Baltimore by a fairly conservative family and ministering mostly in the South. This was not a place, this was not a position he came to quickly or on his own, right? And so he describes in that process how he changed, how he came to understand the movement of the Spirit differently through the testimony and the witness of people in his church and in our society. And he writes about that. And then he writes about what it was like for him, newly elected as the primate of our church, to go into conversations with all of the other primates across the Anglican Communion, among whom this is a very small, this is a minority position, and where the United States is deeply suspect for all the appropriate reasons. And he talked about how he had to learn what it feels like to stand and to kneel at the same time. And what he means by that is to stand with your integrity and the clarity of what you believe has been revealed to you, what you believe, what you value. And at the same time, kneel in compassion and respect before another child of God, even the ones who would take who would just wish you ill or have a completely different view of what God's will is. And also in that kneeling to recognize that none of us has perfect revelation and that we all fall short of the glory of God. And I take that as a personal spiritual practice, as to the best of my ability, and I commend it to all of us. To learn how to be clear when we're clear and where we're clear, but with an adequate dose of humility and then compassion and love for all with whom we interact. Doesn't mean that we change we're still standing, right? But where there's a part of us that is kneeling in respect and honor. It's not the same as being a doormat. It's just being human. So with that, we will continue on. We all have work to do. And I would simply ask that you tend to the next faithful step in whatever ways your life and leadership are revealed to you. As a diocese, we have a few steps to take. As Peter said, the next step that will be public, we will continue to work on language. We will take all of this data, put forward a resolution in draft form. It will go before the drafting committee of resolutions, right? And that's their job to help those. We'll go before the regionals, and regional leaders will have an opportunity to engage. And then we will go to convention. And as Peter said, it will not be a resolution with a monetary amount, or how we're going to go. All the how questions will be worked on in a later iteration of this work. And if that's something that you feel called to, we will have some kind of nomination process for that group as we did for the first. Okay. Do you have any questions for me, or any questions really? Is there anything you'd like to ask, or any thoughts that you feel really important to share? Okay. Yes, Peter.
I do just have a housekeeping thing. As you head out, if you would tear off the question burst sheet where you recorded the questions, and just leave them on this purple table over here. We will collect them, we'll take them down, and we'll make sure that we kind of get that. It'll be a big document, obviously, but we'll send it down.
And we'll synthesize and figure out how many duplicates we have, all of that. Okay, stop for a minute, tearing all your pieces of paper, and I'll pray for us, and then we can tear away. It's okay, it's okay. Any other housekeeping? What about chairs and stuff, Peter? Do you need some help with breaking down tables and chairs?
I mean, we love it if you want to stick around. Yeah.
Okay, so a few of us, if you got time to stick around and help clean up, Calvary has church tomorrow, and we can help turn the parish all around. Another round of applause for Calvary. I'd love to pray for us all to make our way. Gracious and merciful God, I pull before you all of us here as we come to the end of this rather remarkable day. And we entrust everything to you. Everything, Lord. All that we have, all that we are, all that we've inherited, all that we hope to pass on. And I ask your particular blessing upon this work, this initiative, one of several, of course, as you know, that we try to hold in faithfulness to you. And I pray that your spirit of compassion and courage, prophetic truth, and the call to proximate justice, Lord, might guide us all. That we might not speak and act simply from what we know in our heads, what we've seen with our eyes and felt in our hearts. Help us to walk toward your dream with hope that indeed one day your kingdom will come on earth as you have promised and as it already exists.